Hi, I'm Beck, and I started Nature Mental Health. It began publishing in January of last year, and so we now have a full year under our belt. And it's been really helpful to kind of hear the various not only the journal representation, but I think the stakeholders in this process, because this is something that I really think is that we need to kind of cohere around, is the idea that what are the incentives for researchers? I totally support the idea of the kind of bottom-up approach of researchers sort of requesting these things, but in the fact of the matter is that when people are pushed, it's much more likely that they're going to adhere to guidelines as opposed to if they're just doing it on their own. And so obviously, things like common data elements are helpful. And I think if we are to kind of establish what the sustainability is, we really should be looking at the funding mechanisms first and to see how that sort of plays out in the research. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have faced in the last year in terms of reporting checklists has been the issue of BESH versus clinical trials. And so this, I would be actually really fascinated to talk more with the people from NIH, because there isn't a very good consensus around what should be considered, especially when it comes to neuroimaging, I think is where this really gets to be an issue that, even if individual researchers have registered a study and have registered it as a clinical trial, it doesn't always necessarily map clearly onto what we would want for a clinical trial. And so then once we get the actual findings of that study, how do we help authors to sort of present that in the best way possible? So in some cases, we really had sort of one paper that kind of was the biggest issue, which was a brain stimulation paper. And so what we decided to do was to actually ask the researchers themselves, would they like to have this consort formatted, or do they feel like their study was more of a BESH study, in which case we could use sort of our just standard in-house nature checklist. And so that's what they decided to do. And we actually asked them, what do you think, in principle, in terms of you sharing your research with others, how best do you think this should be presented? And so that was really sort of, a big litmus test for us about how we want to go forward with this. So I think that's one of the pieces, and obviously, there's so many different techniques here, but to think about, what the standards within the broader scheme of sort of anything reporting around medical interventions, or in our case, mental health interventions, and how we want to sort of consider those in the broader landscape, but then also from a neuroscience perspective, what is helpful. So I would say that that's probably the biggest issue that we've faced so far. But going forward, we are very interested in clinical trials, but I would say that the majority, and I don't have the data yet to look at this specifically, but the majority of papers that we're getting are brain-based and often neuroscience-based papers. And so it's something that we consider on a daily basis and how best to do that. So I think this is a very much needed initiative. And so I'm hopeful that we'll be able to come up with some very useful things for authors as well. So that's basically all I have to say. Just listening and taking lots of notes.
Thank you very much, Beck. Thank you for joining us. But I can see Simon is with us from Human Brain Mapping.
Yes, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for organizing this and the opportunity to share a few thoughts from the perspective of human brain mapping. For those who do not know the journal and not know it well, Human Brain Mapping publishes paper mainly related to neuroimaging, particularly human neuroimaging, covering basic neuroscience, covering methods development, and to some degree, clinical applications or translations. And we are very committed to openness and transparency. And in fact, I, as the editor-in-chief, have also been part of the COBIDAS committee that Cyril already mentioned. So a lot of good leeway to actually start into the checklist discussion. But actually, after all that we've already heard, really want to focus on 2 points that make me a bit hesitant or skeptical. Not in terms of the value of checklists, but in terms of the adaptation. And there are 2 points. One is very much mirroring what Cyril already said. Really, checklists are usually very comprehensive. It's more of a, what would I like the authors to report? That, however, in most cases is too much. And there's then I would almost say, quite a bit of pressure on the other side to sidestep it, or in the worst case, to provide selective reporting. That is, you throw quite a bit of information in there to tick many boxes in the checklist, but potentially ignore those where you know that your study has their weak spots. In fact, in my feeling, this kind of selective reporting has already become a little bit of an issue in response maybe to things like the COBIDAS guidelines. And so if I want to draw the line even a bit further, it feels that for all the good intent, for all of the confirmations and, let's say, support, endorsement, even requirement of sharing policies and transparency policies, there's almost an equivalent game of sidestepping these. What highlights this best, in my view, is our, in fact, rather negative experience with data availability statements. So authors are required to provide data availability statements. And by far the most common statement is, data is available upon reasonable request, which is basically saying, get away. Or maybe not, or I don't care. It can mean all of these, right? And I'm kind of worried that these kind of counterproductive approaches will likely then require more stringent requests for checklists. Like, they're not recommended, but they're actually required, and you have to require to check every single box with a clear answer. And that then leads to the other problem I want to mention, which is that not every checklist item pertains to every single paper. So as I said earlier, we have a lot of basic neuroscience papers, we have a lot of methods papers, quite a few clinical papers, and naturally, not every checklist item will pertain to every paper. For us, it becomes even more difficult than in other fields, as you mentioned from Hamed at the beginning, because we have fMRI papers, EEG papers, TMS papers, and so on. So naturally, people will only be able to answer parts of the checklist items. Now, my personal worry, and I'm sorry for being the bad and negative person here, is that the combination of you can't enforce a full checklist coverage, like answering every single item, and the tendency of people to, let's say, move sideways whenever they can, will actually limit the usability of checklists as enforced by journals. So I'm actually kind of more low level, putting my hopes into editors, into reviewers, into communities, helping to push standards. But I'm a little bit more skeptic, even though we endorse checklists, that they, as endorsed, mandated by journals, by funding agency, will really have that kind of impact that we envision they should have. Thanks a lot.
We have a couple of others who basically joined us today. We have Sabine from Journal of Neuroscience and Society for Neuroscience, and we have a discussion with SFN as well in terms of how the society could get involved, and I'm happy that we have Sabine with us today. Sabine, do you want to share any kind of thoughts? Just say hello.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sabine Kastner. I serve as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Neuroscience. I'm listening just in. I actually share quite a bit of the skepticism that was just raised by Simon. I think the problem is that we have so many different fields which have, different checklist needs, if you want so. And to put this all into one comprehensive one seems to me unmanageable from the end of the authors, because they have to go through items and items that are, not of relevance to them. So I think we should probably also think more broadly about how can we raise method standards in our fields and the reporting of that. So checklists are one approach, but probably not the only one. So for me, this discussion is much more about, broader, really reinforcing the scientific rigor and trying to come up with some kind of standards that we as scientists could all agree upon. How to do that is just a really hard question. So really, really appreciate this initiative and, the community that you have brought together here, because I think it's really important for us to just start talking about that and brainstorming, and then we'll see where we arrive, and we will not find, the perfect solution as it goes, but just making a step forward, whatever that step will be, would go a long way, I think. Thank you for having me here.